Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Islam for Europeans. I'm your host, Robert. Please like and subscribe to the channel. So, I wanted to do a book review today. I had a chance to read this book right here. It's called The World Without Islam by Graham Fuller. Graham Fuller is a former vice chairman of the National Intelligence Council of the CIA, former senior political scientist at RAND, and currently an adjunct professor of history of Simon Fraser University, author of numerous books about the Middle East, including the future of political Islam. Graham, I believe, is a non-Muslim, but this book is not an anti-Islam book. Actually, the title is misleading. It's a pretty interesting thesis. Basically, the thesis of the book is: had Islam never existed, would we see a totally different world today? Would all the civilizational problems between the East and the West be resolved? And his response to that is no. And he cites that various social, political, socioeconomic factors, war factors, have all contributed to the ongoing conflict between the East and the West. So even if Islam didn't exist, let's say Islam never existed, we would still see similar to the same problems today. So it's a pretty compelling argument. It's quite an interesting thought experiment. I think that every convert should actually have this book, and I say that because not as like a book of religious instruction, but this book is geared towards non-Muslim Westerners. It's pretty easy to read, so it might be a good book, as an introductory book for your family members to read, your non-Muslim family members, especially if they have like an open mind. It's all about decoupling the argument that Islam is the cause of terrorism, marginalization, anti-American sentiment, anti-Western sentiment. There are a whole host of political factors that have galvanized these types of feelings, not just in the Muslim world, but in other non-Muslim areas of the East. China, Russia, India. So it's a pretty good book. Now he doesn't. This is kind of a limitation of the book, and actually respect Graham's decision not to go into this. Is he doesn't really look at it from an Islamic scholarly perspective. He doesn't. He has very few quotes from the actual Islamic scholars about various topics like FGM, or yeah, cultural practices done in the Muslim world that have nothing to do with Islam, but it's done by the people of that region. But I'll get a little more about that later. So at first he talks about you know the era before Islam. So basically, even before Islam came on the scene, there was still a huge struggle between the West, which is considered now Europe at the time, and the East. So that includes North Africa, the Near East, even Byzantium, and Russia. So it was always a battle between groups and tribes for resources, for territory, and this was basically the this is basically the way it was back then in the pre-modern era. You had different warring tribes warring against one another. So it makes a pretty compelling argument because people think that all these problems occurred before Islam, all these conflicts occurred before Islam, but it's totally not the case. And he also talks about when Islam finally came on the scene, right? It expanded into the Holy Land. It expanded into East Africa, and you had a population that was already expressing anti-Western sentiment, right? So this was just basically par for the course. So they had already had battles between Rome and what is back then Constantinople. So there was they converted to Islam, many of them, not all of them, but they also even the Christians and the Jews in that region at the end already had this kind of like anti-Rome sentiment. He also talks about the battle between the two different the different Christian denominations. There was an enormous level of hatred and conflict between Rome, right, and what was back then the seat of Eastern Christianity, in what is present day Istanbul, but which is now Constantinople. So these conflicts were already there, right? So the Rome wanted to take over Constantinople because they thought themselves to be the true church, and the same went for the Eastern Orthodox Church. They had the same level of like distrust and resentment, even in terms of like language. In Rome they spoke Latin, and in the Byzantine region, they spoke Greek. So yeah, I mean, even if Islam never existed, let's say most of the Muslim world would be Orthodox Christians, and you still have this, this battling, between these groups because it existed before even Islam arrived. Right. He also talks about, you know, um, Islam in Russia. So, Russia is an example where you have large, minority Muslim populations, and they all existed under like under Russian rule, and they've many Muslims have integrated into Russian society, right? So it's not a there's no question of like a Russian being a Russian Muslim and that conflicting with one's like ethnic identity, even though most of the Muslims are not white Russians. Most of them come from like Turkic background. Um, but still, even in Russia, there's a very anti-Western sentiment. So, that friction in Russia didn't exist between non-Muslim Russians and Muslim Russians. This idea that, the West should be distrusted, that, we should resist American hegemony and things like that. Um, he also talks about Islam in China. So, there's half of the Muslims in China are Han Muslims. So, there's already, there's no kind of like distrust based, on Muslim populations who are already ethnically Han Chinese. Now, he does mention that, the Uyghur Muslims, they're being oppressed, not because of religion, not because of Islam per se, because, they want separation, they're a different ethnic identity. So, the problem there is more ethnic than religious. Yeah, and he talks about the events of 9/11. This book was actually written in 2008 when Barack Obama got elected. It's important to keep that in mind because this whole argument, this whole idea, you can extrapolate to other things that that are hot button issues in 2024, and I'll get more into that later. But he talks about Muslims living in the West, and like and how there's conflict. There's definitely this feeling of marginalization, but one of the main points of his book is that Western interventionism has been the leading cause of anger and resentment in the Muslim world. Whether that's the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, and going way, way, way back. Like establishing puppet dictators in places like Iran. So like it's all just like basically like a battle for resources. And to put the blame on Islam, to say that Islam is the problem, it's a gross oversimplification. And yeah, like when you take Islam out of the equation, you still have these like these inner resentments, right? And like I just wanted to read one of the passages that I thought was interesting, because what we're proposing Islam for Europeans is kind of a different solution to Muslims living in the West, that I don't think really has been articulated before. So, but when you read books like this, that kind of take like an orthodox approach, to solving the issue of Muslims living in the West. What does integration mean? It really kind of begs the question. So he says here, um, yeah. So he talks about Muslims living in the Netherlands, basically. And he says the problem is self-reinforcing because working class and poorly educated Muslims are not easily able to assimilate or even engage in European culture. As a result, they feel marginalized, are viewed as outsiders, often feel alienated, and retreat into their own cultural shell, thereby reinforcing stereotypes of Muslim resistance to assimilation. Um, Resentments grow, and the symbolism of different clothing, food, and language become more emotive on both sides. The Netherlands may represent one of the most serious examples of this problem. A Dutch parliamentary report in 2004 determined that multi-ethnic society had been a dismal failure. Huge ethnic ghettos and subcultures were tearing the country apart and the risk of polarization could only be countered by Muslims effectively becoming Dutch. This is a depressing conclusion since the proposed solution, Muslims becoming Dutch, is ill-defined. What does it mean to become Dutch? To be indistinguishable from traditional Dutch citizens except for visible physical characteristics, or entirely stripped clean of former linguistic and cultural characteristics of their original homelands? Or are there certain minimal Dutch characteristics that should be required while others not? Judging by patterns in any number of countries, assimilation is a process that requires several generations, even for a serious acculturation to occur, let alone actual assimilation. So right here, I mean, you can see that he's pinpointing the problem, which I think is very astute of Mr. Fuller. Now, what's the solution to that? I mean, you have Muslims coming, from other countries coming into the Netherlands. Most of them, I think, mostly come from Indonesia, which is a former Dutch colony. And this book was written in 2008. I don't see the problems getting any better in the Netherlands. So what he's saying about, it takes several generations to occur. It's already been another generation, and the situation is getting worse. In fact, Geert Wilders was announced that he is going to be, the leader of the Netherlands if he can form a coalition government. So, the time is now. I mean, we need to find an alternative solution. And the whole idea of Muslims becoming Dutch, in their eyes, what that means is that, they're going to take on things that are not really allowed in Islam, accepting liberalism and things of that nature in order to quote unquote become Dutch. What we're suggesting is a much easier solution that, you have Muslims of non-Dutch origin living in the Netherlands, right? For those who convert to Islam from a Dutch background, those people who are from a Dutch background should incorporate, as he said right here, the language, the food, and the clothing. They collectivize into a sub-community of Dutch Muslims. Muslims of non-Dutch origin support the idea. They say, look, we're all Muslims, but we are from an, Indonesian background or Arab background. We have our own culture that we don't want to give up. But in order to show that Islam is for all cultures, our nascent converts who are coming in and converting in mass numbers, they need to form their own society of quote unquote Dutch Muslims. So they're not doing anything haram, but they're incorporating the traditional dress, the traditional clothing, the traditional cuisine, as long as there's nothing haram to it. That's the best way to solve this solution. And the time is now. I mean, it's 2024. I don't see the problem getting any better. So, I mean, I thought there was a pretty good passage. I think Graham was really good at pinpointing the problem, but yeah, like I said, this is taking the idea that Islam is the problem out of the equation. Right, so he talks about Islam in India. I mean, he talks about the fact that Indian Muslims are being severely oppressed in India, and this has nothing to do with Islam itself. The main issue that he thinks that Muslims are so oppressed is partition, basically. So overall, I think it's a really good book. I think the solutions that he proposes at the end, they're pretty. They're pretty basic in terms of, it's pretty simple. Just stop messing around in Muslim countries. Easier said than done. I mean, you have Western governments that, basically don't stop. I mean, like our governmental elites, they try to impose liberalism in these Muslim countries, endless war and invasion. And if not invasion, supporting of, dictators, that, are completely composed to any type of free speech come from Muslim populations. So that's what he recommends, I guess, on a governmental level. Like his, basically the solutions in his book near the end, focus on directly on governments. But we can't really change that. All major parties in all Western countries pretty much have the same policy vis-a-vis Muslim countries and populations. But at the very basic micro level, we can make a change, and I do believe that if when we look at problems between Islam and the West today, you just have to take Islam out of the equation. I mean, he does quote Tariq Ramadan in this, saying that we have a problem, we have this issue. Westerners have this problem of Islamizing problems. Like this, like there's a bombing that occurs, or Muslims don't want to integrate. They say, well, Islam is the problem. We're suggesting it's the opposite. There's a whole bunch of other socio-political, cultural factors, that create this tension. And even when you look at the Groypers and the dissident right, um, they're trying to decouple Islam from the problem as well. So there's a lot of Muslims, even in mainstream on like the center or the left, who are basically Islamizing problems. So they're basically doing the opposite of what Graham is saying here. That they don't like us because we're Muslim, which is understandable why they would think that way, because the only people that they talk to are your David Woods and your apostate prophets and your Jordan Petersons, who have nothing but disdain for Islam. But it's like what the dissident right is doing, and like I said, I don't think we should ally with the dissident right, but they're trying to decouple Islam from these arguments as well. So I think it's really important to do that. I think that this can be done with our solution without having to give into adapting things that are against Islam. It just basically comes down to, do converts, do they have the initiative enough to take this on? And do you have a Muslim community that's willing to support this idea, so that the tensions between Muslims and Westerners are a little bit less of a pressure cooker than they are right now. Right, so that's my time for the day. Like I said, pick up the book, see if you can find it. It's on Amazon, A World Without Islam, Graham Fuller. I would like to maybe even interview Mr. Fuller if he has time, because I think I'd like to get his take on the world now, in 2024. But like I said, this book, even though it was written in 2008, it really rings true today. I think it's a very interesting thesis, and I think that we should have these kind of thought experiments, because I think it's a good way of kind of like of appealing more to like non-Muslim Westerners who don't know a lot about Islam, who don't really like to talk about religion, but if their main thing is like politics, and then that gets infused with like religion and Islam. I think this is a good way to go. And then on a final note, I'm inshallah writing my own book, how Islam can save the West. I like how Graham says that this book is an argument, not a narrative. So he goes through different parts of history, and those are important points. But it's not to present a story. It's to basically say, this is my thesis. These are my arguments why that Islam is the problem, and challenge the arguments that are being made against you. So I am going to present the Islamic side of the story, and trying to get the information about things that have nothing to do with Islam, or very little to do with Islam, that people think have to do with Islam. So cousin marriage, for example, female genital mutilation, things that are practiced in Muslim countries that are either they're not obligatory, or they're not allowed at all. So for example, cousin marriage, Muslim, it's very common in Muslim countries. Is it halal? Is it acceptable? Yes, it's okay. You can marry your cousin in Islam, but it's not something that we do in the West. And if you look at African American populations today, even starting from the 1960s, consanguine marriages among African American Muslims is basically non-existent. So that's my time for the day. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you think in the chat, and take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.